You talked about developing a trusting relationship with yourself in the context of the systems that weren't designed with us in mind, and just appreciating your sharing around that. One of the things I was taking away is recognizing that even in defining trust, it's different for each person. You gave the example with your parents. You gave some good examples. Hey, I don't care if you're late or whatever. And so just giving some examples, just highlighting that there are differences in how each of us measure and determine trust. What are some of the enabling conditions that can create those opportunities for us to have these conversations in the open about what our differences are in terms of how we're looking at trust and how that's measured or how we're each interpreting that? What are some of the enabling conditions? Because one of the messages that I'm getting is it's going to be different for different people. But the question I have is, okay, so how do we create the space? What are the conditions that we can create to acknowledge that those things exist, but then also find ways to relate to one another where we feel whole?
Yeah, I love this question. I think I've been fortunate and blessed to be a part of a few spaces that are predominantly women of color, or exclusively women of color, I should say. And hands down, almost every time in those spaces, there's a range of different contexts in which this happens. And it happens with Black women, groups of Black women, or groups of women of color generally. Someone will say, I feel seen.
Mm,
And it's so rare that I feel seen. And I think it's true for so many of us.
mm,
The project of colonization and oppression, patriarchy, white supremacy is a weapon. And I think spaces where we can feel seen and we can feel heard are so necessary right now. And what makes a space one where people can feel seen and heard? I think number one is listening, deep listening. There's so much distraction in the world, and I have to find myself to put down the phone, like pay attention.
oh, yeah.
But I do think really honoring the humanity of the people who are called to share themselves with us is an important step. I think for white allies, doing your homework is pretty important. So if you're taking the time to understand how privilege works, to understand history, what has happened to generations of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in this country and globally, right? I think this point around really treating folks' stories as sacred,
Mm,
treating folks' experiences as sacred is critical. I'll often say each of us, our truth is true to us, right? And that's true for someone I might disagree with too, right? And maybe their own relationship with themselves is contorted until their truth is, I don't know, that's not for me to say. But for them, their truth is true. And I think even just acknowledging that can be a step in the right direction to be able to have the harder conversations about where those truths might be. I'm thinking right now about people who deny that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. Clearly, that's something that some people believe. If I start from a place of that isn't true, that's no one's going to have that conversation. If I start from a place of that's true for you, but let me share my experience, and let me share my experience,
talking about
it's
dialogue now.
hard. Yeah, there's more spaciousness. I think there's also, in terms of how we bring about trusting conditions, it feels like in so many places and spaces in our world right now, everything is compressed. It's like we have this much time to do this many things. And so I also feel like trust requires spaciousness. We need time for our bodies to unravel, for our stories to unfold. And we often don't give ourselves the gift of that time. Sometimes we need time for people to go think to a conversation. It can't be rushed. And folks talk about it. Stephen Covey and Adrienne Marie Brown both talk about moving at the speed of trust,
Speed of trust, yeah.
which is true. It's very true. And there are dynamics around the speed of trust that are culturally informed that we don't talk about. If you come from a marginalized community that has had terrible experiences, I'm from California. In California, there's a genocide against Native American people whose grandparents were in boarding schools. A conversation with a white government official may have, or even just a person who comes from a different background,
Yeah,
there
yeah.
might be an inherent level of distrust. And there may need to be time to allow that relationship to unfold.
Yeah, there may need to be time to allow that relationship to unfold. I'm remembering just an example at one point in time, there being some initiative that was designed to increase trust between police officers and communities of color. And the setup at that time was to connect a person from the community with an officer. And we're going to have this sustained commitment to build conversations, to reduce misunderstandings of one another. But one of the things, this is in the past, a working experience. One of the things I remember raising was the setup and the backdrop of that was like, okay, there were officers there who wanted to have this conversation in full uniform with weapon and like all these other things. And there's some apprehension around that. I'm like, can y'all put some plain clothes on if y'all want to make this happen? Like those sorts of things. It's one of those things. I think for me, in some ways, it speaks to at least what's coming to my mind as you're sharing around those. It's cultural, it's power dynamics that exist, it's racialized, it's a lot of things. And when those things aren't discussed, we just have the event or we do the thing and we say, all right, everybody, let's talk. But without acknowledging there's some history, there's some context here that is missing and that needs to be discussed if we want this to be an initiative, an event that is true to the values that we're putting behind it.